Seguimos con la siguiente sesión que abordará el tema La Gran Historia, teorías del todo e historias centrales. Invitamos al moderador Francisco Aravena, máster en periodismo de Columbia University y editor y conductor de Crónica Estéreo, podcast de actualidad de Diario La Tercera.
Hola, ¿cómo están? Buenas tardes. Gracias por acompañarnos ahora. Vamos a presentar a nuestros conferencistas, partiendo por David Christian, historiador, presidente fundador de la Asociación Internacional de la Gran Historia. Actualmente vive en Sydney. Es autor de Maps of Time, An Introduction to the Big History. Sus últimos libros son Origin Story, A Big History of Everything, A History of Russia, Central Asia and Mongolia, volumen 2, y Future Stories, What's Next. Como comentaristas contaremos con Jacqueline Dussaillant de la Universidad del Desarrollo, doctora en Historia, con investigaciones centradas en la historia social y cultural de Chile, y se ha especializado en las áreas del consumo, la publicidad, el comercio y la ciudad. Actualmente es profesora e investigadora de Faro UDD, del Núcleo de Humanidades y Ciencias Sociales de la Universidad del Desarrollo, y es miembro de número de la Academia Chilena de Historia. También contaremos con la participación como comentarista de Juan Alberto Lecaros, abogado de la Universidad de Chile, bachiller en filosofía de la Pontificia Universidad Gregoriana de Roma, magíster en bioética y además doctor en filosofía de la Universidad de Complutense de Madrid, director del Observatorio de Bioética y Derecho de la Universidad del Desarrollo, profesor asociado del Centro de Bioética de la Facultad de Medicina Clínica Alemana, Universidad del Desarrollo en Chile. Les damos la bienvenida a nuestros conferencistas, los invitamos a pasar.
Boy, I'm enjoying this conference. And I'd like to start by thanking...
Closer to the mic.
Sorry?
Closer to the mic. Talk closer.
Too close. Okay, is that better?
Get closer.
Oh, get closer. Okay. Okay, is that good? Okay. I'd like to thank Klaus and the other organizers of the conference and the inspirers of this conference for a wonderful topic. It's a topic that many people are skeptical about, which is why so many universities and institutions are nervous. They would shy away from a topic like this. But I actually think this is a very good time to be talking about theories of everything. I think there are two main drivers of the skepticism. One is globalization, because what globalization has done, it's been so rapid in the last 2 centuries that it means that no community's theory of everything can be insulated from competition from others. So every large story now faces competition, and its authority has been undermined. So that's one reason why the skepticism about theories of everything, whether you call them religions or philosophies or origin stories, whatever you call them. And the second reason, I think, is the modern explosion of knowledge. Since the 19th century, there's been a colossal increase in the sheer amount of knowledge and information we have. And scholars and researchers throughout the world retreated, basically since the 19th century, into this structure that is now so familiar we take it for granted, of disciplines, academic disciplines. And the disciplines have started to behave like nation states, with well-policed borders, passports. And the result is that those who try, if you ask questions that cross many borders, you can find yourself like some of those unfortunate people who get stranded at airports without a passport and live there for the rest of their lives. You know, you're homeless, you're stateless if you're looking for a theory of everything. And this is no joke, because in today's world, we live in a world where crossing disciplines is becoming more and more urgent. After all, we as a species are beginning to manage an entire planet. Something has happened that hasn't happened in 4 billion years. Now, managing a planet cannot be done simply with climate science or a bit of chemistry. You also need politics. You need literature, inspiring literature. So it's an urgent topic, immensely important. Now, let me just give you a sort of roadmap for where I'm going, so that what am I doing? So that if you get lost, you'll at least find it easier to get back on track. There'll be 4 parts to this talk. The PowerPoint, by the way, is pretty uninspiring, but I'm going to put it up there to help you keep track. 4 parts. In the first part, I'll offer a simple and loose definition, way of defining theories of everything, deliberately non-reductionist, and a simple typology. In the second part, I want to talk about big history, which is my own attempt to construct a sort of theory of everything that's historical in nature, and that part of the talk will be quite personal. In the third part, I want to float an idea which has really come into focus for me since being invited by Klaus to give this talk. So this is a bit of an experiment. And the idea is a sort of theory of everything for theories of everything. And you'll see what I mean when I get to it. And in the final part, I want to argue that there is emerging in today's world a new, and I'll call it a core story. And it's a story, the first core story, that's designed for all human beings. And it's designed for the rapidly emerging community of humanity as a whole, humanity as a species. So those are the 4 parts of my talk. Okay, defining theories of everything. I believe the acronym TOE was first used by physicist John Ellis in 1986 in a Nature article. It was on string theory, and he was arguing that string theory offered the basis for a theory of education, a theory of everything, and you've heard that idea already today. It was a hard reductionist idea of theories of everything. Natural to physics, I think, that sort of theory, because after all, physics deals with the physical world at its most fundamental. So it's a natural approach. And in fact, hard reductionism, as I call it, has, I think, been dominant in science from the time of Newton, really until the late 19th century. The classic example of this was Laplace, the French mathematician Laplace, who argued in the early 19th century that if we had enough information, as science developed, we could predict the entire future of the universe with great precision. So this is reductionist in the sense that it had a very tight idea of how scientific rules work. But since the late 19th century, hard reductionism has gone into decline. And I think there are many reasons for this. One is quantum physics, which seemed to show that there's a sort of indeterminacy or vagueness at the smallest level of reality. Chaos theory showed the same thing. It showed that the tiniest of precisions get magnified at higher explanatory levels, which makes nonsense of any attempts to predict from the lowest levels of understanding. Then Kurt Gödel's famous incompleteness theorems seem to argue that even in logical systems, there is you cannot guarantee perfect proofs all the time. So increasingly, people began to think of science as offering looser descriptions of reality. The American philosopher William James put it well when he wrote, "The parts of the universe have a certain amount of loose play on one another." And a physicist, Phil Anderson, in 1972, again, drew out the consequences of this. The ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws does not imply the ability to start from those laws and reconstruct the universe. So it's harder to defend hard reductionist theories of everything nowadays. And in addition, I think more and more of us are aware that we are very small creatures, and we see a vast and mysterious universe through a keyhole. Most of it we cannot see. But how loose should our theories be? You can go to the other extreme, and I'm based in the humanities, where some of my colleagues think we shouldn't even take seriously the ideas of reality or truth. Now, I'm not going to go that way. I don't think that makes sense. Let me offer one argument. It's the one argument that I find most persuasive for realism of some sort, and it's biological. It is that the blind processes of natural selection have equipped all living organisms with sensory mechanisms, and that suggests two things. One, there is something out there to be sensed, and two, sensing it matters. So I think we have to begin from a sort of realist position if we're gonna talk seriously about theories of everything. And the position I think is most appropriate is one sometimes called perspectival realism. It's linked to Kant, and it begins with the idea that we see the world from a particular perspective. So theories of education, theories of everything are about a real reality, but they see it from particular perspectives. And that explains why they come in many, many varieties. So in the spirit of this conference, I want to offer a definition, a loose definition of theories of everything. They are attempts by human communities to make sense of many domains of lived experience, including, but not only, the physical world. Theories of everything see the world from the perspective of particular communities living in particular times and places and with particular needs. Theories of everything offer unified, coherent visions of the world that shape many different types of knowledge and behavior for the societies that generate them. And finally, something that's often missed in discussions of grand theory, theories of everything can be enchanting. They can engage us at an emotional level, and that's why they can inspire action, and that makes them powerful. So defined, theories of everything come in many, many species. And this next slide is just designed to sort of hint at that idea. They may include physics or string theory. They may include universal philosophies, such as those of Hegel or Marx. They probably include all institutional religions, and I think they certainly include indigenous origin stories of many kinds. And they include attempts to account for the whole of the past, historical theories of everything, if you like. So that's a hint at some of the diversity. Eric Chason's model of cosmic evolution is a theory of everything, of course. And here's a quick typology. I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing it, but I basically try to rank theories of everything along two axes. The first is how reductionist they are. Some are more reductionist, some are less reductionist. And the second is how universal they are, how ambitious they are, how much of reality they try to explain. So I'll leave that there for a moment, but I'm not going to spend much time on it. Now, let me go on to the second part of this talk, which is about my own attempts to construct a historical theory of everything, which has come to be known as big history. This will be quite personal, but please forgive me, because I think my account of how a once respectable junior academic began teaching theories of everything illustrates some of the difficulties of constructing theories of everything in today's world. So as a young researcher, like most researchers, I did two types of research. Research as discovery of new information, and also research as synthesis of already known information in the search for meaning. My conventional research, I was a Russian historian, was in the material life of 19th century Russian peasants. Like many scholars of my generation, I felt that Russian historians had focused far too much on the the elites of Russia. I wanted to know more about ordinary Russians. And I had a young family. So I was fascinated by questions like, how do you feed babies in a time of famine or drought? So my first book was co-authored. It was a history of food and drink in Russia. But I got more and more interested in the drink side of all of this, and particularly in the role of vodka, because everyone knows vodka plays an important role in Russian life. And eventually I published a book on the role of vodka in Russia in the 19th century. And the big payoff, I mean, it took me on a tour of taverns, of village festivals, and of the Ministry of Finance. And the payoff to the book was that throughout the 19th century, the sale of vodka, that's to say a mind-altering substance, generated on average 40% of government revenue for 100 years. Now, that was enough to pay most of the costs of the army that made Russia a military superpower. So that was my modest contribution to the discovery of new information about Russia, and I'm quietly quite proud of it, actually. But the other side, as a teacher, trying to make sense of what was already known about Russian history, eventually expanded out of control. It began with a question, and the question was, I'm a historian, what's the use of history? And historians are remarkably coy about answering that question. And I thought, well, surely we can all agree that knowing something about the past gives you some illumination in the present. It helps you understand the present and perhaps think clearly about the future. So I thought, if that's true, it ought to be true at many scales. So why do historians focus on just a few scales? On the scale of the nation state, for example, or biographical scales? It's a bit like someone driving a car who's never been told how to get out of gear 1. You know, you're stuck in gear 1. I thought, shouldn't we also be looking at the past at the scale of thousands of years? Or in a world that was rapidly globalizing, and in which you could see before you the emergence of a community of people who thought of themselves as global, the community of humans. In such a world, shouldn't we be teaching history courses on the history of humanity? Now, that's a scale of several 100,000 years. So I thought, I wonder if I could teach a course in the history of humanity. I still know of no courses like that in universities. So I then thought, oh my God, but if I teach a course on the history of humanity, I have to think about biology, because we're a species. So we would encounter humans as members of a very homogeneous species, not in the way most historians encounter them, as divided into multiple competing tribes. We'd see them as one species. So I'd have to talk about biology and evolution, and I'd have to think about how mammals evolved, how multicellular organisms evolved, how life itself evolved, and I thought, oh my God, that means studying planet Earth. That means studying geology and astronomy. And I thought, this is an infinite regress. I'm going back and back and back until I realized, of course, that cosmology, the discipline that studies the universe, had recently undergone a revolution. In the 1960s, as I think Eric Chasson mentioned, Big Bang cosmology was suddenly clinched by the discovery of the background microwave radiation. So the story had a beginning. So I thought, great. There's a story to be told beginning 13.8 billion years ago. Could you do that in a university? Well, in 1989, with colleagues from across the university at Macquarie University in Sydney, I began teaching such a course. It attracted 400 students from right across the campus. We had lecturers from many different disciplines. In 1991, I wrote an article in which I was forced to think of a label for what I was doing. So I came up with the cute label Big History, and I'm not at all happy with it, but it's stuck, so I'm stuck with it. And it proved catchy, which was helpful. In 2004, I published the first big book on telling the big history story, Maps of Time. Teaching big history was exhilarating, and to use a word I've already used, enchanting. It was exciting. I and many of my students felt like escapees. We'd escaped from the history discipline, and we were on a sort of intellectual safari that took us across many, many different disciplines. It was really exhilarating, except some students weren't exhilarated. I remember one came up to me and said, "Why can't we spend more time talking about World War I? What's all this Big Bang stuff?" You know, I thought, there's no hope for some people. Anyway, there was a problem though, and the problem was this a coherent story? The astronomers used astronomers' jargon. Sometimes they wrote equations, and my history students shuddered. They used their own jargon, they asked their own questions, they had their own methodologies. Then the geologists came in and they talked about igneous rocks, and again my history students were confused. And so each lecturer seemed to tell a different story, and the stories didn't seem to fit together. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, and I really worried that there wasn't a coherent story to be told, that this was a mess. But magically, over 3 or 4 years, as I sat in on all the lectures and I took tutorials with baffled students, a coherent story began to emerge. And it's a story you've already heard about. It emerged around the theme of complexity, entropy, free energy. Eric Chaisson, I later learned, had been doing this for years before I thought of doing this. The early universe was very, very simple. Then gradually, over 13.8 billion years, more complex things appeared. Atoms, molecules, stars, planets, living organisms, eventually human beings and human societies. And this coherent theme was about us, because it was about how complex things in general were created and how we were created. And that gave us a powerful plot line to the story. Wonderful questions and a powerful plot line. And there were many partial solutions to this question: how did complex things arise? And you've heard some of them already today, so I won't discuss them. Random processes within scientific laws seemed occasionally to arrange things into structures that proved resilient and had emergent qualities. The idea of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, added spice to the story. Now, Eric Chaisson talked like a scientist about entropy. I'm talking like a historian about entropy. So it was a great narrative idea. If the scientists hadn't given me the second law of thermodynamics, I'd have had to invent something like that just to spice up the story. But it created wonderful puzzles like a detective novel. If it's true that building complex things in our universe is really difficult, how the hell were they created? How were we created? How were modern societies created? Now, there are many wonderful, deep, profound answers to that question, and I'm not going to try to go into them here. It's not the time, but I hope this gives you some shape of the story. Today, big history is taught in probably a few hundred schools, mostly in North America and Australia, in a few universities. It still remains marginal, but it's very different from what it was 30 years ago when I began. There's a journal, there's a scholarly society, the International Big History Association, there's an emerging literature, there have been conferences of various kinds. It's still marginal, it's still a niche project, which is why I'm obsessed with people's skepticism about such projects. But it's on the map, as it were. Now, I want to move on to the third part of my talk. And big history led me to ask questions about human history that most historians don't ask. Above all, it encouraged me to ask the unifying stories. This is what all theories of everything do. They ask you, they invite you to look for the unities across disciplines. Now, in my case, across all human societies, what commonalities were there? And as I said, most historians focus on differences, on the differences between different communities. This forced me to look for commonalities. And one of the commonalities that I came up with when I was thinking, what am I doing, was the idea of origin stories. At first I thought I was very original teaching big history. Then I realized every society we know of has tried to construct a historical theory of everything of some kind. And they're often called origin stories. So I began to think of big history as a modern, science-based origin story. And that's the sort of thinking that led me to the idea I'd like to develop now in the third part of this talk. And it's an idea, I'm not completely sure it's correct, but I think it's a good one, and I'd like to try it out on you. And it is, as I said before, a sort of theory of everything for theories of everything. So, here's the idea. It is that behind the great diversity of theories of everything, there lurks a single, multifaceted cultural phenomenon that can be found in more or less extensive forms in all human societies. And I stress all, going back to the evolution of our species 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. And that arises from the uniquely human project of trying to make sense of existence. Now, I'm not sure what to call these objects. I'm going to call them core stories, mainly because I can't think of anything better. If anyone has any suggestions, please tell me. So I'll refer to them as core stories. Now, let me begin by responding to a question that some of you may have. If indeed this phenomenon is real, why do scholars not talk about it? Well, I think there's a very good reason, and it goes back to the division of knowledge into disciplines, which fragments our vision of reality. And what it means is that scholars in different fields have seen different core stories or different aspects of core stories. They've described them in such different ways that they look like different things. So philosophers of science look at the sorts of core stories that we call science, that are based on experimental data, probably don't have many gods or spirits lurking around, and so on. Students of religion, scholars of religion, focus instead on core stories in which there are gods and spirits of many kinds and powerful moral rulers. Indigenous origin stories are described mainly by anthropologists. So the result is we think these are different objects. What I'm going to argue is they're actually all species of the same underlying object, and theories of everything are also examples of that underlying object. So let me attempt a provisional definition of core stories. You'll notice it's similar to my definition of theories of everything, but it's broader. So here goes. And then what I'm going to do in the next part is unpack this definition. First, core stories exist in all human societies because they arise from the uniquely human project of trying to make sense of existence. Core stories bring together in more or less coherent forms a particular community's understanding of how the world came to be as it is. That's perspectival. That's why I used the word perspectival earlier. How the world came to be as it is, how it works, and what kinds of behaviors are appropriate in such a world. They contain rules of survival for communities in a particular time and place. Enchantment. Core stories can inspire collective action because most members of society believe them to be true and find them inspiring. Finally, core stories play many different roles in society. Those roles are linked, and shared belief in them ensures that they can inspire collective union, collective action, and a sense of community. Because they're passed on carefully, extremely carefully, from generation to generation, they can create a sense of community that endures in time. So I'm arguing this is something that is unique to humans, that has existed in all human societies. Okay, now I'd like to describe core stories in slightly more detail. Three main aspects of them. First, they are a universal and defining feature of human societies. Their existence is one of the things that defines us as a species and makes us so different. They are present in all known human. Something that fits this definition can be found in all known human societies, and I think it's a very good bet that they existed also in all unknown human societies, though I couldn't prove that. One of the reasons for saying that is that we humans have this exceptional capacity through human language to share ideas with great precision and in great volume and at great speed. And what that means is that we can discuss the meaning of the world, we can accumulate information, we can share information in a way that even very brainy species like chimps can't do. So, there's a very good reason to think that they have existed in all human societies. They are unique to our species, I believe. We know of no other species that can plausibly be claimed to have attempted to construct theories of everything or to debate the meaning of life. And this is powerful, this sharing of information, because it allows accumulation of information. And that is a fundamental driver of human history. Over 200,000, 300,000 years, human communities have accumulated information. Information gives you power. Knowing how things work gives you more power. That information has accumulated. So as it's accumulated, our power over our environment has accumulated very slowly at first. So slowly, most people think there was no change at all. And then faster and faster and faster, and now at an absolutely terrifying rate. So they're powerful, they're unique to our species, and that accumulating information, held together partly through core stories, explains why today we're the most powerful species on Earth, and we're the most powerful species that has ever existed in 4 billion years of life on Earth. I'm prepared to defend that argument later on if anyone doubts it. So that's the first thing. The second thing, core stories are coherent, but they're not monolithic. Now, they're coherent, they have shape, they have some degree of unity, they bring together a lot of different sorts of knowledge, and they can create a sense of unity. But they are not monolithic. Within all core stories, you find debate, disagreement, argument, heresies, fights. There's plenty of disagreement over the details. Within core stories, many people try to freeze them and fix them. I'm thinking of doctrines like papal infallibility. But the truth is they always change. And that changeability is immensely important because it means they can adapt. They can adapt to different changing perspectives and changing needs. So their bagginess, their looseness, just as William James said of modern science, it's as if their parts, there's a certain looseness in the working of their parts. Their bagginess means they can evolve, and that means they can adapt and change to the changing needs of particular communities. And that means they must be judged not by some absolute criterion of truth, but by their adequacy to the particular societies they serve. So what this means is, if you parachuted a textbook on modern physics into Australia 20,000 years ago, and let's assume that the locals could read it and understand it, it would have been completely useless because it wouldn't solve any significant problem for them. And the most useful thing they could do with it is use it to light a fire. Yet today, that's not true. In a world of 8 billion people, when we need to feed 8 billion people, we desperately need modern science. You can't live in a world with smartphones and not take science seriously. They exist also because of this bagginess and changiness in more or less extensive forms. And this matters. In many societies, probably in most societies for most of human history, they've been coextensive with a particular society. That means every member of that society saw them as the truth, the way things were. They felt like absolute truth. but very often they exist in less extensive forms. They may tell a society about how the world works, but not about moral rules. Today, science is very good at that. It tells us how the world works. It doesn't really give us moral rules. On the other side, religions still give us moral rules, but their power to describe the world, how the world works, has diminished significantly in recent centuries. In today's world, globalization means that all core stories are battered by competition and their authority has been undermined, so they all exist in less extensive forms. Now, the third general point I want to make about them is that they shape human history because they play many different roles in human society. And this is an idea I've pinched from an American biologist, Ursula Goodenough, who is very interested in the intersection between religion and science, and argues that all religious traditions have many roles to play, many linked roles. So I'm riffing on that idea, and I'm going to argue that core stories play several, so these are the three general features I'm describing. Core stories play, let's go back, play several roles, and I'm going to list 5. And I'll just describe them very briefly. The first is just descriptive. They describe the world. They contain information about botany, about astronomy, about animal migrations. They tell you how the world works from the perspective of a particular community. They contain the survival information that community needs. And they must work. That information must be good. It must be adequate for the society. Secondly, they are spiritual in the sense that they can enchant people, they can inspire people, they can touch them deeply emotionally, they can touch their sense of awe and magic, and they can therefore inspire action. They are powerful motivators. Thirdly, they contain moral rules. They tell you what is good behavior and bad behavior, and this too is perspectival. They contain the moral rules that society needs. Fourth, they're political. Because they're shared by everyone, they create a sense of unity, of belonging and collective action. They are like badges of membership. So they organize collective action politically. The French sociologist Durkheim argued that all traditional religions play this role. And finally, they are the foundation of education, because they're passed on with immense care from generation to generation. I've recently read a wonderful book about education in traditional oral communities. And what came out of me most powerfully for that was the immense care with which information, knowledge, moral rules was preserved and passed on from generation to generation. So they can create a sense of community that crosses generations. Now, core stories are powerful because these roles are linked. Let me give it as an example the powerful linkage between the descriptive and the moral aspects. The philosophers will tell us that there's no logical link between an is and an ought. You can't get moral rules from descriptions of the world, and that's why most scientists are very reluctant to offer moral rules. But everyone who's studied the so-called naturalistic fallacy knows that in the real world, there's a very powerful link between descriptions and moral rules. Hume knew this. And the reason is obvious. We humans are purposeful beings. We act with purpose. We don't accumulate information just out of curiosity. We don't study climate change just because it is so fascinating. We study it with moral purpose. So the descriptive and moral roles of core stories are always linked in all societies, and the other roles are connected with them as well. So that's why they are such powerful drivers of what happens in societies. Extensive core stories play all these roles. Less extensive core stories may play only some of them. In today's world, as I've already suggested, science plays the descriptive role very powerfully, more and more powerfully. Doesn't play much of a moral role, although it's beginning to exercise moral influence. The churches, traditional religions, play the moral role very powerfully, but their power to describe how the world works has diminished in recent centuries. Okay, now this is all a bit abstract. So let me give you, you've seen that slide of Newton already before. Let me make it slightly less abstract by giving examples of what I mean. One is Newton's core story. Newton grew up in a world that had a very extensive core story, and it was in his blood and in his mind. For him, the science of his day and the theology of his day were profoundly linked through the idea of a creator God who created the world as it is and who also laid down moral rules. The story contained moral rules. It could inspire action. He lived through the Civil War in his childhood, which incidentally is proof of what I mean by saying core stories are not monolithic. There's always room for competition, debate within them, sometimes violent debate. It could help unite a large national community. England was united largely by the sharing of this core story, and even dissident minorities shared their own core stories or their own versions of the core story. And finally, it provided the foundation for most forms of education. So it played all these roles that I'm talking about. Just one more quick example. That is indigenous core stories. What we know of indigenous stories suggests that they too play all these roles. When anthropologists look at indigenous stories, they often look at what is exotic or intriguing to us. And that means they often miss the boring parts. The boring parts are often about botany, about animal migrations, about astronomy. All oral societies seem to have good astronomy. So there's a huge amount of good, why not call it scientific information, embedded within the core stories of oral societies. Powerful moral rules. They can inspire, of course. Rituals played a huge role in this. They can inspire action, and they can inspire collective action. They create a sense of community, and finally, they are the foundation of education because they're passed on so carefully from generation to generation. Okay, that's the end of the third part. I'm keeping an eye on time. I think I'm on track. Now, the final part of this talk. In the final part, I want to argue that a new core story is emerging in today's world. It's the first core story that is designed for the entire community of human beings on Earth, the first global core story. And its emergence is a matter of immense significance for the future, because it will shape how human beings act in the next 100 years. So let me end with this argument about a new core story. Today we live in a world without a single core story. All existing core stories have taken a battering through globalization. And so we live in a sort of fragmented world. And many scholars for much of the 20th century argued this is simply the condition of modernity. The French postmodernist scholar François Lyotard argued that this is the postmodern condition. We're doomed as moderns to live in a world without a unifying story, without theories of everything. Now, what I'd like to argue is another perspective. The intellectual debris that is all around us, the intellectual rubble that's all around us, made up of older core stories, bits and pieces of new stories, can be interpreted as the debris of a demolition site, which is what the postmodernists do. Or it might be the debris of a building site. And that's what I'd like to argue, that something is being built in this messy cultural world, and it's a new global core story. It's being built partly from the rubble of older stories, but partly from newer types of information. Much is already half built, and the emerging core story, think of it as an embryonic global story that'll be shared by all humans that is about to be born, not quite born yet. But it's already playing, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but it's already playing many of the roles of traditional core stories. So let me explain that. It's playing the descriptive role very powerfully through modern science and all the related disciplines, from modern philosophy to economics, you name them. And there's a very simple reason why it's so effective in the descriptive role. It works, as we've already seen. You cannot live in today's world without the knowledge of science. Now, that explains why it also plays a powerful educational role. Even in religious educational institutions, science plays a role that would have been unthinkable a few centuries ago. So it's playing the descriptive and educational roles already very powerfully, and it plays them in a similar way in every country in the world. In that sense, it's global. Secondly, the moral role, its moral role. I'll spend a little more time on this because you may take more persuading on this, because we look at the world and the media that have an interest in creating horror stories, create a vision of a world impossibly divided by cultural differences and also by moral differences in moral rules. But I'd like to argue that if you look beneath the surface, what's actually happening is a sort of convergence on a global moral ethic. Now, let me give some evidence. I don't have time to give much, but some evidence for those of you who are skeptical of this. There are really three sources of this convergence. One is globalization, the fact that conversations, including conversations about morality, now take place across the world. Let me quote the philosopher Peter Singer on the impact of globalization on ethical thinking. If the group to which we must justify ourselves is the tribe or the nation, then our morality is likely to be tribal or nationalistic. If, however, the revolution in communications has created a global audience, then we might feel a need to justify our behavior to the whole world. This change creates the material basis for a new ethic that will serve the interests of all those who live on this planet in a way that, despite much rhetoric, no previous ethic has ever done. These global conversations help explain help explain why there is a sort of moral convergence. Let me give just one more example of this, and this is religious convergence. In 1993, a parliament of the world's religions issued a declaration towards a global ethic. It was based on a draft by the Swiss theologian Hans Küng and signed by representatives of more than 40 different religious traditions. It insisted that, and I quote, "A common set of core values is found in the teachings of the religions, and these form the basis of a global ethic." So globalization is one driver of convergence on a moral ethic. A second one, I think, is simply the fact that the extent of communications is so great that more and more people are aware of themselves as members of a global community. And that raises novel moral questions. It raises questions not about the moral needs of this community or that community, but what are the moral needs of human beings in general as a species? And in fact, this is the source of what some people call a naturalistic ethos. What do members of our species need in order to thrive? Not just food and drink. They need psychological values as well. They need companionship. They need a sense of membership. Just as we can talk about dolphins thriving, what do humans need to thrive? And the answers to those questions, which are emerging in many forms, will also be part of an emerging global ethos. And there's a third source, and the third source is new problems. I've talked about a perspectival approach to theories of everything. Well, in today's world, we have to see the world in new ways because we face new challenges. So we will need to develop a sense of ethics around issues like climate change. Now, in my view, it's emerging very rapidly indeed. When I was a child, no one talked about climate change. Today, we live in a world in which the United Nations, every single member of the United Nations, has signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, those goals are a sort of roadmap for a good future for humanity. You can be very cynical, and probably quite rightly, about the rhetorical aspects of this. But nevertheless, the fact that every single government in the United Nations has signed off on what is a moral, profoundly moral document, I take as a very profound sign of the emergence of a global moral ethos. Now, the converging moralities, yes. The inspirational and political roles, the emerging core story is not playing on a very significant scale. And there's a very good reason for this. Very few people see the story, very few people believe in the story as a whole, partly because they can't see it, and so many people are committed to older core stories that already exist. If, though, this story becomes more visible and more widely accepted, it holds out the possibility of coordinating the activity of humans throughout the world in building a sustainable future, in organizing the collective action of all human beings on Earth. So the emergence of this new story is a matter of great significance. And that's where I would like to conclude. That's where I'd like to conclude. The emergence of a new story matters immensely because it holds out the possibility of coordinating the actions of humans in general in the way that past core stories coordinated the actions of particular communities, and creating a sense of loyalty to humanity as a whole. Will it emerge rapidly enough to play this role? I have no idea. I wish I did. But that question, I think, is a challenge to every scholar and every researcher in today's world. If you're remotely persuaded by these arguments, then it means we all have some sort of role to play in teasing out, in building this new core story, and in helping to disseminate. I thank you for your attention.
Invitamos a pasar a nuestros comentaristas Jacqueline Dussaillant y Juan Alberto Lecaros.
Bueno, quisiera agradecer la oportunidad de estar acá. Para mí es un honor y un problema comentar The Big History, debo decirlo. Pero de verdad, fuera de broma, la verdad que gocé el libro, es muy interesante, lo invito a leerlo. Digo problema porque yo me dedico a la historia cultural, me dedico a la historia de la publicidad, del comercio minorista, de lo urbano, siglo XIX y XX. Entonces, el Big Bang me queda big, pero bueno. Considero que quizás la mejor manera que una historiadora, desde mi perspectiva, puede aportar a comprender The Big History y la obra de David Christian es quizás metiéndola dentro de un contexto que es lo que solemos hacer los historiadores. En este caso, un contexto más bien historiográfico, y eso es los 10 minutos que me quedó clarísimo que tengo que correr en eso, es lo que quisiera compartir con ustedes. Durante muchísimo tiempo, la historia la entendíamos básicamente, o se entendía básicamente como el registro de acciones y decisiones que algunas personas con renombre hacían dentro del quehacer público. y que finalmente se limitaba a lo que entendemos como historia política. Afortunadamente, esta visión reduccionista de la historia ha sido superada y, de hecho, el trabajo del historiador David Christian, no su primera etapa dedicada a la historia rusa y soviética, pero sí cuando ya empezó a interesarse por esta Big History, es un ejemplo de cuánto ha cambiado y cuánto se ha abierto a la historia en términos de temáticas, perspectivas, metodologías, etc. Para comentar su aporte a la historiografía, quisiera poner su trabajo en contexto desde 3 perspectivas y voy a recurrir, para tratar de no aburrir a nadie, a un par de historiadores con un par de libros muy particulares que yo creo que realmente contribuyen a comprender la originalidad de Big History. En primer lugar, no cabe duda entonces que el trabajo historiográfico ha experimentado cambios importantes en términos metodológicos y también epistemológicos. Hace casi ya un siglo atrás, por ejemplo, en torno a una revista multidisciplinaria francesa que se llamaba Les Annales, se congregaron investigadores de diferentes disciplinas y áreas del conocimiento, como la historia, la sociología, la economía, la antropología. Esta reunión en torno a esta revista permitió la generación de diálogos e influencias mutuas entre aquellos intelectuales con formaciones académicas obviamente diferentes. Esto dio, yo diría, una bocanada de aire fresco a la tendencia hacia la especialización excesiva en algunas de estas disciplinas. Puntualmente para el caso de los historiadores, este intercambio contribuyó a enriquecer, creo yo, su trabajo de distintas maneras, pero básicamente porque les propone, al tener un diálogo con otras disciplinas, propone nuevas preguntas, nos obligamos a hacernos nuevas preguntas y abordar esas preguntas desde nuevas perspectivas, no aquellas desde las cuales nos formamos. De manera que su objeto de estudio y sus fuentes se fueron diversificando. Uno de estos historiadores, el francés Fernand Braudel, en 1949 publicó su tesis doctoral bajo el título El Mediterráneo y el mundo mediterráneo en la época de Felipe II. En esos entonces, a mediados del siglo XX, era un trabajo bastante revolucionario desde el punto de vista historiográfico. ¿Por qué? Básicamente porque Braudel pone como protagonista de la historia al océano, por decirlo de alguna manera. Es el Mediterráneo, el espacio mediterráneo, su clima, sus recursos naturales, el protagonista de esta historia. ¿Por qué? Porque le sirven de marco dentro del cual él ubica grandes imperios, pequeñas comunidades y que las observa en términos económicos, sociales, políticos, en la época, obviamente, de dicho monarca español. Si bien esas miradas a gran escala tenían un antecedente importante, la medida gran escala, si era al tomar un océano me refiero, tenían un antecedente en esos entonces bastante importante a través del estudio de las civilizaciones que ya había empezado a publicar el historiador británico Arnold Toynbee. Lo interesante, creo yo, de Braudel en este caso, es que propuso entonces una categoría para trabajar el tiempo, cuestión esencial para nosotros los historiadores, una categoría de análisis que sigue vigente hasta nuestros días. Me refiero a la distinción que hace en la duración de los procesos históricos y que él lo divide, lo clasifica, si ustedes quieren, pero como herramientas de trabajo, en 3 temporalidades. Una, la primera, la corta, en francés, événement, es decir, el acontecimiento, el hecho puntual. La segunda es la mediana, que obviamente es súper relativo, pero para dar una idea, podría oscilar un acontecimiento de mediana duración, podría durar entre 5 y 100 años, una cosa así. Y finalmente, él introduce el concepto también, una tercera categoría de larga duración, es decir, es aquella duración que se mide en siglos y por lo tanto es esencial, es fundamental para Braudel cuando hablamos de procesos que van cambiando muy lentamente, hablamos de procesos de larga duración. La economía, por ejemplo, ha cambiado a lo mejor en términos de mediana duración en algunos momentos de la historia, pero a lo mejor la familia como institución ha ido cambiando muy lentamente y ahí a lo mejor habría que estudiarla desde una perspectiva de larga duración. El tema es que desde entonces muchos historiadores se han embarcado en aventuras desafiantes y ambiciosas en términos tanto espaciales como temporales, ofreciendo análisis amplios que de algún modo daban respuesta a ese viejo anhelo de hacer una historia universal, lo pongo entre comillas, que superara algunos intentos hechos por filósofos e historiadores decimonónicos. Incluso desde antes tenemos muchísimos ejemplos, por ejemplo, partiendo por San Agustín, Hegel, esfuerzos globalizantes de entender la historia humana desde sus propias perspectivas, por supuesto, pero también muchos historiadores, sobre todo en el siglo XIX, quizás ustedes mismos tuvieron en algún momento en sus manos un libro de historia universal, cuyo primer capítulo era Europa, segundo capítulo era Europa, tercer capítulo era Europa, y quizás el quinto capítulo era Oceanía, América y África. ¿Es eso historia universal? Dicho esfuerzo unificador en parte ha resurgido al iniciarse el siglo XXI en Estados Unidos en torno a la revista The Journal of World History y más todavía con los primeros pasos dados precisamente por Big History, en la que David Christian es sin duda alguna principal protagonista. Lo que quiero decir es que este historiador no se limita al Mediterráneo, como Brodel, no se dedica o limita al clima, como Leroy-Ladurie, que es otro historiador francés, o a las civilizaciones, que son grandes temas, como Toynbee, sino que su estudio abarca ni más ni menos que el planeta completo. No solo eso, también las galaxias, no solo eso, el origen del universo, porque considera que conforman un sistema dentro del cual la especie humana es solo una parte y una pequeña parte. Además, si para Brodel la larga duración era un espacio temporal de ritmo lento y dilatado, apto, como les decía, para estudiar las diversas civilizaciones en términos de siglos, Christian apuesta por lo que podríamos denominar, no existe, como muy larga duración en términos brodelianos, ya que su interés se despliega en millones de años. Segunda perspectiva. Para abordar su aporte desde otra mirada, me voy a referir a un libro que escribió un historiador italiano que sigue muy productivo, que se llama Carlo Ginzburg, y que en 1976 publicó un libro con un curioso título, Il formaggio e i vermi, es decir, el queso y los gusanos. Revisando archivos judiciales, Ginzburg se encontró de pronto con el expediente completo de un juicio llevado por el Santo Oficio de la Inquisición en contra de un molinero italiano entre los años 1583 y 1599. Duró harto el juicio, pero bueno, en términos de Big History es nada. Quien finalmente fue condenado por herejía a morir en la hoguera. Sin saberlo, en ese momento, y con dicho estudio, Ginzburg se aventuraba en algo que luego empezó a denominarse como microhistoria. Entenderán para dónde voy. Esto es, a través de un caso puntual, claro, como juicio para una persona más de una década, pero en términos de historia es un caso muy puntual, que es el juicio contra un molinero de nombre Domenico Scandella, y Ginzburg a través de él entra en su cosmogonía, reconstruye a través suyo el mundo de las clases populares en esos finales del siglo XVI. En otras palabras, aborda el estudio de un grupo social mayor ingresando a través de uno solo de sus integrantes. Pero hay otro detalle que me hace vincular este libro con el trabajo de David Christian, y es ese curioso título que ya mencioné, El queso y los gusanos. Esto remite a una descripción que el propio Scandella, el molinero, utilizó para explicar su particular idea acerca de la creación del mundo, que a su entender se había dado no por obra de Dios, lo que lo condenó, sino producto de lo que él denominó un, entre comillas, caos primigenio, fines del siglo XVI, del que luego, comillas nuevamente, se formó una masa, como se hace el queso con la leche, y en él se formaron gusanos, y estos fueron los ángeles, cierre comillas. Esas son las palabras dentro de este juicio, digamos, que encontró Ginsburg, que escribieron los inquisidores sobre la explicación que se hacía este molinero. Estamos hablando de una época en que no era fácil acceder al conocimiento, acceder a los libros, y sin embargo él tenía esa particular, en una Italia completamente católica, por supuesto, esa particular idea de cómo se forma el mundo, que no había sido Dios, sino que había sido de esta forma. Ahora, ¿por qué hago esta relación con el trabajo de Christian? Tras las palabras de aquel molinero que vivió hace 5 siglos atrás, podríamos decir que hay un bosquejo precientífico precisamente de lo que hoy llamamos Big Bang, con gusanos con leche, pero básicamente lo mismo. Y es precisamente el Big Bang una puerta de ingreso para la mirada que hace David Christian acerca de la historia del hombre en nuestro planeta. Así, mientras la microhistoria de Ginsburg y de otros más, con la microhistoria el historiador entra en el pasado a través de un pequeño intersticio y lo estudia de manera muy minuciosa, como entrando en el detalle, casi como, me incluyo, digamos, casi como si tuviéramos en la mano un microscopio. Es profundizar, 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 entrar en los detalles. Christian, en cambio, aleja la mirada y observa su objeto de estudio como si para ello dispusiera de un telescopio. Esto le proporciona una perspectiva diferente. Se desdibujan los detalles, evidentemente, pero gana en perspectiva. Dicho de otro modo, si hay uno que entra en el árbol, Christian es capaz de ver, no los gusanos dentro de los árboles, pero sí ve el bosque. Esto le da una perspectiva distinta, de manera de que sus preguntas, por lo tanto, y sus observaciones adquieren absolutamente otra dimensión y efectivamente otra escala. Él ya lo acaba de mencionar. Por lo tanto, su Big History ya no abarca siglos, sino millones de años, como ya señalé, y asimismo, más que observar individuos en particular, se interesa por la especie humana en general, pero además en su triple dimensión de pasado, presente y ojo, y futuro. Los historiadores normalmente podemos hacernos preguntas vinculadas o pensadas en el futuro, pero básicamente yo siempre leo las noticias igual que todos ustedes, pero yo siempre ando un siglo atrás. Siempre estamos colgados más bien en el pasado. Por lo tanto, que un historiador ponga parte de su estudio no solamente en el presente, en el pasado, sino que además una visión de futuro, me parece sumamente interesante. Es cierto que en su trabajo el individuo se desdibuja, se deslava, pero si se pierde ese detalle, se ganan otras perspectivas y aparecen preguntas que si no somos capaces de plantearnos. En consecuencia, en términos espaciales y temporales, la historia que propone Christian sobrepasa completamente la escala humana. De hecho, él concibe 8 fases u 8 umbrales, como las denomina, que finalmente, podríamos decir 8 periodos, si ustedes quieren, dan orden a su narrativa, le dan coherencia, y en la que apenas, en esos 8 umbrales, esos grandes 8 periodos, apenas aparecen las sociedades humanas. El primer umbral, hace 13.800 millones de años atrás, lo constituye evidentemente el Big Bang. Luego le sigue la aparición de las primeras estrellas, la multiplicación de los elementos, hasta que recién en el quinto umbral surge la vida. Y es en el sexto de 8 donde aparece el Homo sapiens con su particular capacidad de aprendizaje colectivo. Luego le siguen las grandes civilizaciones aparecidas con la revolución agrícola y los excedentes de energía hace unos 10.000 años atrás. Por último, el octavo y último umbral lo sitúa, ojo, hace tan solo 200 años, con la revolución industrial y su globalización. Este cambio de escala le permite a Christian observar que el enorme dinamismo de las sociedades actuales son absolutamente una excepción en esta big history. Es decir, es una capita dentro de todo el periodo que la abarca, y este aceleramiento de la vida claramente es una excepción reciente. Lo normal ha sido estructuras básicas absolutamente o relativamente estables. La tercera perspectiva, para comprender el aporte de Big History en general, pero sobre todo el particular oficio de David Christian como historiador, quisiera relacionarla con su diálogo con otras disciplinas. Me refiero a estos esfuerzos por conocer o generar conocimiento a través de un estudio genuinamente interdisciplinario. Muchas veces hablamos de interdisciplina, pero en realidad hacemos multidisciplina. Acá claramente hay un cruce de conocimientos. Si hace un siglo, por ejemplo, a través de la escuela de Dussaillant que les comenté al comienzo, se enriqueció el historiador al dialogar con la economía, con la geografía, la sociología e incluso con la psicología, en este caso el diálogo yo diría que es muchísimo más audaz, porque el interlocutor parece no estar interesado en las características y dinámicas del individuo y del entorno social en que éste se desarrolla. Me refiero en especial a la cosmología, la geología y la biología evolutiva. Como consecuencia, el diálogo o interacción de Christian con estas disciplinas científicas le llevan a salir claramente del trabajo historiográfico tradicional, ya que no solo, como les decía, se interesa por el pasado, sino también por el futuro. Asimismo, y en esto también se distingue de una historiografía tradicional, sus fuentes son muy diferentes a las con que solemos trabajar los historiadores, en parte porque muchas de ellas provienen de los hallazgos de otras disciplinas, algunas incluso que constituyen teorías, es decir, algunas de sus fuentes son todavía teorías. Lo que lo hace, me imagino, una cosa que está en constante revisión, es muy dinámica. Por último, para terminar, en lo personal, en mi carrera de historiadora y de profesora, siempre he considerado que las preguntas constituyen sin duda la pieza más relevante que hay dentro de nuestras cajas de herramientas disciplinares. Y yo creo que eso se da para muchas otras disciplinas. Son las preguntas las que nos motivan a buscar información, a buscar fuentes, a intentar diálogos, a experimentar metodologías y así a descubrir, a aprender, a ampliar el conocimiento y a su vez a plantearnos nuevas preguntas, nuevas interrogantes. Por esta razón, creo que las big questions, las grandes preguntas de Big History son sin duda una de sus grandes contribuciones. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Jacqueline. Invitamos a Juan Alberto Lecaros.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Buenas tardes, profesor David Christian. Tengo el placer de comentar una obra realmente fascinante. Mi registro es otro. Yo vengo del derecho, pero también de la filosofía. Y de la filosofía mi interés principalmente desde el fenómeno de la vida, las implicaciones que tiene para una ética contemporánea, una ética para el futuro, ¿no? Y bueno, la filosofía se hace esa también big question, ¿no? Y esas preguntas de alguna manera que están detrás del trabajo del profesor David Christian. Entonces quiero en primer lugar agradecer, compartir con nosotros esta visión que tiene de un programa de investigación, digamos, que tiene una difusión muy amplia a nivel internacional, sobre esta concepción integral del pasado, ¿no? Que es tanto una big history, pero también una historia de los orígenes, y a eso también me quiero remitir, digamos, hacer la pregunta filosófica, digamos, sobre los orígenes, ¿no? Y que él lo denominó en su libro Maps of Time como un mito moderno de la creación. Me llamó la atención esa expresión, digamos, ¿no? Pero a su vez es una mirada histórica, digamos, a gran escala, pero con una visión prospectiva. Una visión prospectiva que nos plantea preguntas sobre cómo debemos pensarnos como humanidad en el futuro, y en un futuro ahora para el futuro, ¿no? Bueno, y agradezco a los organizadores esta oportunidad de hacer esta pequeña contribución a este diálogo precisamente interdisciplinario que sin duda es el diálogo que constituye uno de los sellos de nuestra universidad. Primero tengo que aclarar cuál es el punto de partida, mi perspectiva. Yo creo que la palabra perspectiva está en el corazón, diría yo, de la epistemología de la Big History. La perspectiva de la cual quiero comentar la conferencia no es de Jacqueline, ¿no?, el de la historia, sino de la filosofía, y específicamente desde la epistemología, ¿no?, que se pregunta cómo se conoce aquello que se conoce. Y a partir de ahí hace una observación acerca, yo creo que lo fundamental del mensaje que nos entrega hoy en día el profesor David Christian, cuál es el valor de esta Big History para pensar el futuro de la humanidad en la era del antropoceno. Y ese es el rol moral que él asigna a esta nueva core story que le llama él para la época del antropoceno. Entonces mis comentarios se basan básicamente en dos preguntas. La primera, ¿cómo podemos entender por origen? ¿Qué podemos entender por origen, ¿no es cierto?, cuando el profesor habla de historia moderna de los orígenes? Y en segundo lugar, ¿cómo se concibe, y aquí viene un punto central, el observador de ese devenir de la Big History, ¿no?, de este todo a partir de un origen dado precisamente por la evidencia científica? Entonces el primer punto, la primera cuestión es abordar la idea de origen de la cual parte, ¿no es cierto?, la Big History, ¿no?, como un mito moderno del origen, ¿no?, y que es tomada de la evidencia que arroja la teoría cosmológica del Big Bang, el paradigma científico que sin duda hoy en día es más consensuado. Si bien esta descripción, que es una descripción científica coherente y rigurosa del universo como un principio y un devenir, que lo hace de alguna manera histórica, nos brinda un punto de partida, sin duda, al menos científicamente aceptado, para esa historia a gran escala. Pero nada nos puede decir acerca del origen mismo y la pregunta filosófica sobre el origen. Tan solo puede hablar de aquello que deviene después de ese instante inicial. El mismo Stephen Hawking sugiere quizás que la cuestión del origen está mal planteada si concebimos el tiempo como una línea recta. Pero la pregunta persiste, porque desde las tradiciones míticas hasta la filosofía antigua y moderna, la paradoja del origen ha asediado al pensamiento, que ha intentado salir de ella, ya sea afirmando o la eternidad del universo o retrocediendo a una supuesta causa primera. Sin embargo, la primera respuesta termina por eludir la pregunta sobre orígenes, pues evidentemente en una eternidad no hay origen posible. Y la segunda incurre en la contradicción de la regresión al infinito, ¿no?, la causa de la causa de la causa. La filosofía moderna y contemporánea ha enfrentado esa paradoja del origen que ha persistido en la forma de la pregunta fundamental de la metafísica occidental. ¿Por qué hay algo y no más bien la nada? En otras palabras, ¿cómo puede aparecer algo nuevo, la novedad? Por ejemplo, las estrellas, los planetas, la vida celular, pluricelular, la sociedad humana, la conciencia humana. Esto es, estructuras más complejas a partir de aquellas que son menos complejas. Una de las respuestas canónicas a esta pregunta metafísica la dio el filósofo Leibniz, quien postuló el principio de razón suficiente, que dice cada efecto tiene una causa, esta surge de otra causa y así sucesivamente hasta llegar a la causa primera, que es autosuficiente, completa y la causa de sí misma. Esto es lo que se ha denominado en filosofía el argumento ontoteológico, ¿no?, pues es la pregunta del porqué de algo y la respuesta está en esa causa primera autosuficiente, que constituye lo que se ha llamado el Dios racional de los filósofos. Pero no es de extrañar, y el mismo profesor David Christian lo señaló, la filosofía contemporánea rechaza o reacciona a esta fundamentación última del origen de cualquier orden y regularidad, ya sea natural o social, por ejemplo, la vida, la conciencia, la sociedad. Que este orden y regularidad tenga un fundamento externo, exógeno, y fuese de alguna manera el deseo de la filosofía contemporánea más bien de construir cualquier razón última de la verdad y plantear más bien el radical escepticismo frente a cualquier relato fundante que explicara y diera sentido al orden y la regularidad de las cosas. El profesor David Christian nos habló en su charla que uno de los temas que dan precisamente estructura, unidad y coherencia al Big Bang es el hecho de la regularidad y el orden de las distintas estructuras del universo han evolucionado precisamente desde lo menos complejo a lo más complejo, ¿no? Reorganizándose con nuevas propiedades emergentes, y eso pese al creciente aumento de la entropía que se opone a la progresión de estructuras más complejas. Pero la pregunta es, ¿cómo explicar precisamente esos procesos de propiedades emergentes? ¿Cómo explicar precisamente el origen de estructuras novedosas, organizadas cada vez más complejas, desde las partículas subatómicas a la conciencia, sin caer en ese callejón sin salida en el cual la filosofía moderna se situó, ¿no? O más bien el escepticismo frente a cualquier orden en la evolución cósmica, o una suerte de impulso impuesto más bien de afuera, este fundamento exógeno, este fundamento externo que dirigiría, ¿no es cierto?, esta tendencia universal de lo menos complejo a lo más complejo. Para ello necesitamos, por lo tanto, un principio de organización interna que explique cómo las propiedades emergentes surgen. Por ejemplo, la cognición en los sistemas vivos y la conciencia humana. Pero no solo como epifenómenos de los flujos de materia y energía en las estructuras organizadas. Yo, por mi interés en el fenómeno de la vida y las implicaciones éticas que tiene, ¿no es cierto?, para una ética, llamémoslo así, en el mundo contemporáneo, una ética para el antropoceno, donde el hombre se ha transformado precisamente en un gran modificador de toda la biosfera. Me interesé mucho precisamente por la explicación que da de los diversos fenómenos de la vida, tanto de la vida mínima celular, la mente, como la sociedad, la epistemología de la autoorganización de nuestros científicos chilenos de la que se llamó la Escuela de Santiago, de Humberto Maturana y Francisco Varela, que precisamente hunde sus raíces en la tradición de la cibernética de segundo orden, que enfatiza básicamente dos ideas. Uno, y aquí viene un punto importante que es la segunda parte de mi charla, que es el observador está implicado siempre en la descripción de cualquier sistema autoorganizado. Y la información del sistema es clave, no basta por lo tanto con reducirlo a un sistema de flujos de materia y energía. Para esta epistemología de la organización, que va desde lo mínimo vivo hasta la sociedad, se configura una trama o lógica generativa que explica el origen de los fenómenos como un proceso que se da desde adentro, que es autorregulado, que es coherente, que permite salir por lo tanto de esa paradoja del origen en la cual se sitúa la filosofía. Es una lógica circular que pareciera aparentemente paradójica, pero consiste en un proceso interno de autogeneración que surge de la dependencia mutua que se da entre las dinámicas de las partes que constituyen una totalidad y la misma totalidad organizada, ya sea esta totalidad como organismo, como conciencia o sociedad. Cabe preguntarse, eso sí, desde la mirada de una big history a gran escala, desde los orígenes cosmológicos, si es posible extender esta lógica de la autoorganización más allá de los organismos vivos, hacia todas las restantes estructuras del cosmos. Evidentemente, yo en el trabajo de Maturana y Varela no encontré esa extensión, más bien la centralidad estaba dada por el observador en tanto fenómeno vivo. Pero preparando este comentario me encontré con una obra poco difundida que precisamente hace ese atrevimiento de hacer, ¿no es cierto?, una historia, una gran historia, una big history a partir de la idea de autoorganización, ¿no? Es el trabajo de Dussaillant, que se llama precisamente Autoorganización del Universo. Y él publica esta obra en 1980, es un físico, fue un ingeniero, un consultor a nivel internacional, fue uno de los fundadores del Club de Roma, precisamente ese conjunto de personas que en los años 70 pensaron que los fenómenos de autoorganización no estaban llegando a una paradoja precisamente de contraproductividad y exceder los límites, digamos, planetarios. Y que se inspiró precisamente en las ideas tempranas de Maturana y Varela, ¿no? y principalmente en las ideas del físico y químico Prigogine. Y utilizó esta idea de autoorganización en la Big History, ¿no? La autoorganización como un paradigma unificador que abarca todos los fenómenos de la evolución, integrando de manera interdisciplinar la cosmología, la biología, la sociología, pero también la psicología y los fenómenos de la conciencia. Y ahora llego al segundo punto y con esto voy concluyendo. La pregunta que surge entonces, ¿cuál es el rol del observador que está comprometido en la descripción de la Big History? Para la epistemología de la autoorganización, el observador está en el centro de este paradigma, pues en la comprensión de cualquier realidad está incluido el proceso por el cual el observador llegó a esa comprensión. En ese sentido, no podemos describir el devenir del universo como si fuésemos un ojo pegado en una cerradura. Porque nuestra mente no es un espejo que refleje una realidad exterior independiente de nosotros mismos. En general, los procesos cognitivos y del aprendizaje de todos los sistemas vivos están implicados en los cambios de los procesos evolutivos. Lo mismo pasa, ¿no es cierto?, a nivel de la sociedad. Cada solución, digamos, tecnológica que es fruto de nuestras enormes capacidades cognitivas ha conducido a nuevas fases, ¿no es cierto?, de crecimiento que intensifican los cambios en el medio ambiente, aumentando ese desajuste entre la sociedad y los ecosistemas. Y esto ha quedado en evidencia si uno ve simplemente la comparación de las distintas fases o épocas, desde los cazadores-recolectores, ¿no es cierto?, a la agricultura y la ganadería, es decir, de esa revolución neolítica, o de la agricultura a la revolución de la información. Cada una de estas revoluciones, ¿no es cierto?, amplió y profundizó el nicho ecológico de la especie humana, produciendo un nuevo crecimiento demográfico, nuevas oportunidades, sin duda, ambiciones y demandas de los consumidores. Y así comenzó el camino hacia lo que hoy en día nos encontramos, una crisis, una de las tantas crisis antropogénicas, pero sin duda la de mayor escala, que es la que se ha denominado con este término, ¿no es cierto?, desde la geología del antropoceno, ¿no?, en que el impacto del conjunto de las actividades como sociedad constituye una fuerza geológica de transformación a escala planetaria. Y esto es un término que anticipó quien acuñara el término de biosfera, el ruso Bernansky. Y el mismo Bernansky fue capaz de visualizar el impacto que podía tener, ¿no es cierto?, una nueva fase para la historia de la biosfera. Apelaba necesariamente frente a este desajuste metabólico que hay entre la sociedad y la naturaleza a una reconstrucción de la biosfera gracias a la creciente capacidad creativa del ser humano, y llamaba a esta nueva fase, ¿no es cierto?, la noósfera, ¿no?, la esfera del espíritu. Es decir, la capacidad, la inteligencia y la información acumulada como una historia que nos proyecta hacia el futuro. Pero bien sabemos, desde el punto de vista ético, que la enorme capacidad creativa del ser humano, mediante el desarrollo tecnológico, es ambivalente desde un punto de vista ético. Y sin duda con consecuencias y impactos que son muchas veces inciertos e impredecibles. Sin duda podemos lograr con nuestras capacidades tecnológicas aumentar las capacidades de cálculo para anticipar los futuros riesgos globales, catastróficos, incluso existenciales, en estos contextos crecientes de mayor incertidumbre. Pero al final de cuentas la pregunta sigue siendo de orden ético. Es ineludible hacernos cargo de nuestras decisiones aquí y ahora. Aunque es posible que la descripción de nuestro pasado en una perspectiva a gran escala estimule sin duda nuestras capacidades creativas e imaginativas, que es uno de los roles que el profesor David Christian le asigna a esta core history del antropoceno, sin duda, ¿no es cierto?, en el fondo lo decisivo es cómo nos concebimos en esa descripción. Comprender que en el centro, de alguna manera, de esta historia de gran escala está, ¿no es cierto?, el observador humano, ¿no?, y que todas las descripciones que hacemos son el reflejo de lo que hemos, al final de cuentas, decidido ver y entender. Por lo tanto, en el centro está el reconocimiento explícito de una cuestión ética, de nuestra ineludible responsabilidad. Eso requiere un giro, al final de cuentas, no solo de la descripción y el aumento del conocimiento de nuestra historia, sino un giro epistemológico que tiene una radical consecuencia ética, a mi modo de ver. Pues si sabemos que construimos un mundo con otros en un diálogo continuo que trae finalmente este mundo común a la mano, nuestra actitud no puede ser la de reafirmar, ¿no es cierto?, los distintos puntos de vista, sino ampliar nuestras perspectivas, donde el otro tenga lugar y en la cual podemos construir un mundo común, por tomar las palabras de Maturana y Varela. Así, a mi juicio, la función moral que desempeñaría la core story en la época del Antropoceno sería más bien indirecta, ¿no?, siempre y cuando reconozcamos que nuestras reflexiones sobre el cómo conocemos apunta siempre a revisar las bases de nuestro modo de pensar habitual. Por lo tanto, lo que se requiere es un giro más bien epistemológico antes de hacer un giro ético. Pues como decía Varela, toda época es ciega a los fundamentos de lo que toma por cierto y evidente. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos. Damos por concluida esta actividad. Muchísimas gracias a todos por su participación y los invitamos a que continúen para la siguiente conversación.